The passenger count was correct. That's what I need you to understand before anything else. Every crossing that night, every single one, the count boarding at Lincolnville matched the count disembarking at Islesboro. The clicker in my hand, the deckhand's independent tally, the security camera footage the Coast Guard reviewed afterward. All three numbers agreed, every trip. 41 passengers on the 715. 41 passengers off the 715. But there were 43 people on that boat. I know how that sounds. I need to explain how I got here. My name is Daniel Coyne. I've operated the M/V Margaret Chase Smith on the Lincolnville-Islesboro run for the Maine State Ferry Service since 2019. Before that, I spent 4 years as a deckhand on the Rockland-Vinyl Haven route, working under captains who'd been making that 13-mile crossing since the Reagan administration. I hold a 200-ton master license, a valid TWIC card, current STCW certification, and I have never in my career filed a false passenger manifest, missed a required fog signal, or deviated from a charted course. I'm telling you this because the service suspended me 11 days ago, and the language on the paperwork says, unreliable reporting. The union rep told me it's essentially a psychiatric hold dressed up in operational vocabulary. They want me evaluated before I touch a helm again. What I reported was accurate. What I reported was exactly what happened. The problem is that what happened doesn't fit inside the forms they gave me to report it. The Islesboro run is short. 3 miles across the upper west side of Penobscot Bay, from the Lincolnville terminal to Grindle Point. On a clear day, you can see the island's tree line the entire crossing. In good weather, the trip takes about 20 minutes. We run 9 or 10 round trips daily in the summer schedule, fewer in winter. The Margaret Chase Smith carries up to 17 standard vehicles and 250 passengers. She's a steel hull, double-ended vessel, meaning she doesn't need to turn around. The bow becomes the stern becomes the bow, and the captain walks from one wheelhouse to the other at each terminal. It's an elegant design for a short crossing. I love this job. I want to be clear about that. The rhythm of the work, the tidal math, the way you learn to read chop and current by the motion of the lobster buoys. Islesboro depends on this ferry the way a landlocked town depends on its one highway. There's no bridge. Everything comes and goes on our deck: groceries, propane, lumber, medical patients, school children commuting to the mainland. When we cancel a run, somebody doesn't get their prescription. Somebody's kid doesn't get to school. You feel that weight. It makes you take the work seriously in a way that isn't about career advancement. It's about not failing 500 people who have no alternative. The fog in Penobscot Bay is a particular animal. It's advection fog, warm, wet air from the south sliding over the cold Gulf of Maine water and condensing. It can materialize in 20 minutes. You'll be running a crossing in full visibility, sunshine on the wheelhouse glass, and by the time you're loading for the return trip, you can't see the end of your own vessel. In summer, it can persist for days. The bay fills with it like a bowl filling with milk. We don't cancel for fog. Not automatically. The Coast Guard doesn't require it. The decision belongs to the captain, and on a 3-mile run with radar, GPS, AIS, a chart plotter, and the depth sounder, you can navigate safely in zero visibility if you know what you're doing. I do know what I'm doing. The published guidance in the MSFS operational manual says captains should exercise professional judgment regarding restricted visibility conditions, and lists the required mitigations: reduced speed, fog signals at 2-minute intervals, additional lookout posted, radar monitored continuously, navigation lights on regardless of time of day. Standard seamanship. I followed every one of those protocols. I need that on record. What happened started on July 14th. It was a Monday. The morning had been clear, one of those rare midsummer days where the bay looked like a postcard, blue water all the way to the Camden Hills. I ran the first 4 crossings without incident. Normal passenger loads. Typical summer mix of island residents, day-tripping tourists, contractors with trucks full of materials. My deckhand at rotation was Sheila Pham, a second-year deckhand who'd come to us from the Casco Bay Line's operation in Portland. Good worker. Calm in rough weather. Important later. The fog came in around 2 p.m. It wasn't gradual. I've watched fog build hundreds of times. Usually you see it first as a soft gray line at the horizon, then it moves toward you like a slow curtain. This came down like someone threw a blanket over the bay. I was mid-crossing, outbound to Islesboro with 11 vehicles and about 30 passengers, and within maybe 4 minutes, visibility dropped from unlimited to less than a quarter mile. Then less than an eighth. Then I was watching my windshield wipers push moisture off glass that showed me nothing but white. I reduced speed to 6 knots, sounded one prolonged blast on the horn, switched to the upper radar display, and called Sheila on the handheld to post as forward lookout on the vehicle deck. Standard procedure. The chart plotter showed us on course, depth sounder reading matched the chart, and the Grindle Point terminal was painting clean on radar at 1.2 nautical miles. Everything was nominal. We made the dock without incident. The vehicles rolled off. The passengers disembarked. I walked from the island side wheelhouse to the mainland side wheelhouse while the crew turned the deck for the return loading. This is where it started. The terminal at Grindle Point has a small parking area, a waiting shelter, a restroom building, and a ramp approach that feeds vehicles onto the ferry deck in a single lane. The terminal agent, that July, it was Chris Bellows, a seasonal hire from Camden, manages the queue, sells tickets, and provides the captain with a vehicle count and passenger count before departure. These numbers go on the trip log. They're the official record. Chris radioed up to the wheelhouse, 14 vehicles, 37 passengers for the return to Lincolnville. I logged it. 37 passengers. We loaded. Sheila counted bodies as they boarded, walked passengers through the side gate, vehicle passengers staying in their cars. Her count, radioed to me after loading, was complete, 37. I entered it into the electronic log on the wheelhouse console, confirmed it matched Chris's number, and began the departure sequence. Lines off, engines ahead, rudder amidships, and into the fog. About 4 minutes into the crossing, Sheila called me on Channel 7, the crew frequency. Dan, you get the count. 37. Matches Chris. I'm getting 39 on my walkthrough. I didn't think much of it. Walkthrough counts on a loaded vehicle deck are imprecise. People move between cars. Kids climb out of back seats. Somebody walks to the restroom and you count them twice. It's why we reconcile against the boarding count. Chris had 37 at the gate. We'll go with that. Copy. We made Lincolnville. Vehicles drove off. Passengers walked off. I didn't think about it again until that evening. The fog held through the afternoon and into the night. By 5 p.m. it was the thickest I'd seen in 3 years, absolute zero visibility, the kind where you can't see the bow from the wheelhouse, where your horn sounds come back to you strange and flat because the water vapor absorbs the resonance. We ran the 5 o'clock, the 5:45, and the 6:30 on schedule. Lighter loads as the day wound down. The 7:15 was the last scheduled run to Islesboro. After that, we'd make one final return to Lincolnville at 7:45 and tie up for the night. Chris radioed the count for the 7:15 outbound: 8 vehicles, 41 passengers. A bigger passenger count than I expected for the last run. Summer people heading back to the island after a day on the mainland, probably. Maybe a dinner party somewhere on the south end. We loaded. Sheila's boarding count, 41. It matched. I entered it and pulled out. The crossing was unremarkable. Fog signals every 2 minutes. Radar clean, nothing in the channel except 2 lobster boats tied to their moorings off 700-acre island, not moving, painting as stationary returns. Speed 5 knots. The chart plotter track was straight and centered. I could hear the Grindle Point fog signal, the automated electronic horn on the breakwater, growing louder as we approached. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I docked at Grindle Point at 7:38 p.m. The ramp went down. The vehicles drove off into fog so thick their tail lights vanished within 30 feet. Walk-off passengers filed up the ramp toward the parking lot. Sheila was at the passenger gate doing her offloading count. She clicked each person through. She radioed me at 7:44. Dan. Go ahead. I've got 41 off. That's the boarding number. We're clean. Silence for a moment. Then. I've got 41 off and there are still people on the vehicle deck. I leaned forward in the wheelhouse chair. Through the window, I could see nothing but the fog and the faint glow of the deck lights below. How many? 2. A man and a woman. They're standing by the port bulkhead near frame 6. They didn't come through the gate. They're just standing there. They probably stepped aside to let the cars pass. Passengers do that. Dan. They weren't on my boarding count. I clipped every person through. 41 on, 41 off, and these 2 are still here. I told her to ask them to disembark. Grindle Point was their stop, there was no other stop. If they needed to return to Lincolnville, they'd have to board fresh for the 7:45 departure and I'd need them counted. Sheila went quiet for about 90 seconds. Then her voice came back, and the quality of it had changed. Not frightened. Confused. The kind of voice you use when you're trying to describe something you're looking at but can't quite resolve. They're not here. They left. No. I walked to frame 6. There's nobody on the vehicle deck. The deck is clear. Then they walked off while you were on the radio. The gate counter has 41. If they'd gone through, it would read 43. The passenger gate has an infrared brake beam counter mounted at waist height. Every body that passes through it increments the digital display by 1. It's a backup to the manual clicker count. It's not sophisticated equipment, it's the kind of thing you see at a library entrance, but it works. 41. I told Sheila it was a miscounting issue. Fog plays tricks on peripheral vision. Deck lights create shadows on steel that can look like figures if you're tired and it's been a long day in low visibility. She accepted this. I almost believed it myself. We ran the 7:45 return to Lincolnville. 8 vehicles, 22 passengers. All numbers matched on boarding and disembark. We tied up at 8:10 p.m. I completed the trip log, secured the wheelhouse, and drove home to my apartment in Rockport. I didn't file anything about Sheila's sighting. There was nothing to file. A deckhand thought she saw 2 extra people in the fog. They weren't there when she looked again. It was a non-event. Then it happened again on July 16th. Same conditions. Heavy fog, persistent since Monday, never breaking. The bay was socked in solid. You could stand on the Lincolnville terminal and not see water. The 4:30 p.m. crossing to Islesboro. Chris counted 29 passengers at the boarding gate. Sheila confirmed 29. I was partway through the crossing, maybe a mile out, watching the radar, when the intercom from the lower deck crackled. "Dan, I've got a question." It was Sheila. She sounded careful. "Go ahead." "There's a man on the vehicle deck who I don't think I counted." "Where?" "Aft port quarter. He's leaning against the bulkhead. He's dressed like a resident, work jacket, rubber boots. But I don't recognize him, and I walked the deck after loading. He wasn't there." "Did you ask him for his ticket?" "He doesn't have one. He says he's going home." "Everyone's going home, Sheila." "Does he have a vehicle?" "No. He's a walk-on." "Then he missed the gate count." "It happens. Add 1 to the manual tally and we'll reconcile at offload." "Dan, the infrared counter on the gate read 29 when I sealed it. I watched the last person through. Nobody came after." "I thought about this. There are physical ways onto a ferry besides the passenger gate. You could climb the vehicle ramp before it's raised, though you'd have to time it precisely and you'd be visible to the ramp operator. You could theoretically board from the water side if you had a dinghy and enough nerve to approach a moving vessel in zero visibility conditions, which would be suicidal. Neither option was plausible. Log him as 30. Miscounting happens in fog. Copy. We docked at Grindle Point. 30 passengers off through the gate. The infrared counter read 30. The extraman walked off with the others, hands in his jacket pockets, and disappeared up the ramp into the fog. The numbers matched. 29 became 30 because I told Sheila to adjust the count. The trip log recorded 30 passengers. Nobody questioned it. But I started paying attention after that. July 17th. The fog held. 3rd straight day. The morning crossings were normal, light loads, numbers clean. At 1:15 p.m., outbound to Islesboro, I had 44 passengers on the manifest. Sheila was off rotation that day. My deckhand was Kevin Morse, a veteran who'd been with the service longer than I had. Kevin didn't radio me during the crossing. He didn't mention anything unusual. We offloaded at Grindle Point. Kevin clicked passengers through, and his count was 44. But when I reviewed the security camera footage that evening, something I don't normally do, something I started doing specifically because of what Sheila had reported, I saw something I couldn't account for. The camera mounted above the passenger gate captures a wide angle of the vehicle deck during loading and offloading. The resolution isn't great, especially in fog, but you can make out individual figures. I watched the Grindle Point offload at 1:38 p.m. Passengers filing through the gate. Kevin at his post with the clicker. I counted the figures on the screen. 46. I counted again. 46 people visible on the vehicle deck during the offloading process. 44 went through the gate. 2 figures remained on deck after the last passenger cleared. They stood near the port bulkhead. Same location Sheila had described. A man and a woman. Then the camera image smeared, the way digital video does when moisture accumulates on the lens housing, and when it cleared 4 seconds later, the deck was empty. Kevin hadn't seen them. Kevin's count was 44. The gate counter was 44. I pulled footage from the Lincolnville boarding for the same trip. Counted the figures walking through the gate. 44. Nobody extra boarding. No one climbing the ramp or approaching from the waterline. 44 boarded. 46 were on the boat. 44 got off. I sat in my apartment at 11 p.m. watching that footage on my laptop, rewinding the same 8 seconds over and over. The two figures weren't hiding. They weren't lurking in shadows or pressing themselves against a bulkhead to avoid the camera. They were standing in the open, in the middle of the deck, in the same relaxed posture you'd see from any passenger waiting to disembark. And then they were gone. I didn't sleep well that night. On July 18th, the fog was still there. The National Weather Service forecast said it would persist through the weekend. A stalled maritime air mass, warm and wet, sitting over the Gulf of Maine like a lid on a pot. I made a decision that morning that I've gone back and forth on ever since. I decided not to report what I'd seen on the footage. My reasoning was this: the official counts were consistent. Boarding matched disembarkation. The trip logs were clean. If I reported 2 phantom figures on a Foggy security camera, the most likely outcome was that I'd be told the camera had fogged, the image was ambiguous, and maybe I should take a couple of days off. Instead, I decided to test something. For the 10:30 a.m. crossing to Islesboro, a busy run, 36 vehicles, 81 passengers, I had Sheila count at the boarding gate as usual, and I asked Kevin, who was working the vehicle deck that shift, to independently count everyone he could see on the vehicle deck during the crossing. Not at the gate. On the open deck. Sheila's boarding count, 81. Kevin's mid-crossing deck count, 81. No discrepancy. I checked the weather. Visibility at 10:30 a.m. was approximately 3/8 of a mile. Fog, but not the absolute zero visibility soup we'd had the previous evenings. For the 4 p.m. crossing, visibility had dropped to less than 200 yards. Sheila counted 53 at the gate. Kevin counted 55 on the vehicle deck during the crossing. 2 extra. The 6:15 p.m., visibility under 100 yards. The worst it had been. 27 at the gate. Kevin counted 30 on the deck. 3 extra. I was keeping these numbers in a pocket notebook. Not the official log. Just a lined composition notebook I bought at the Rite Aid in Camden. I didn't show it to Sheila or Kevin. Kevin mentioned the discrepancies casually. Hard to get an accurate deck count in this soup, Dan, and I agreed and we moved on. But I had 4 days of data now, and a pattern was forming. The extra people only appeared in fog. They only appeared during crossings to Islesboro, outbound from the mainland, never on the return. Their number increased as visibility decreased. And they were never present in the official count. Not the boarding tally, not the gate counter, not the offloading click. They existed only in the middle of the crossing, on the vehicle deck, and they were gone by the time the boat docked. On July 19th, I went down to the vehicle deck myself. It was the 7:15 p.m. run. Last outbound crossing. Visibility was as low as I'd ever operated in. I estimated under 50 yards, though there's no precise way to measure it from the wheelhouse. I'd already set the autopilot to track the GPS course, something I almost never do on this shorter run, but I needed to leave the wheelhouse. I told Sheila I was going below to check a reported fluid leak on the vehicle deck. She was in the mainland side wheelhouse monitoring the instruments. Kevin was posted as forward lookout. I walked down the internal stairway to the vehicle deck. The fog was so thick at deck level that the overhead lights created halos, luminous spheres of white that didn't illuminate anything beyond their own glow. The vehicles were gray shapes. I could hear the engines thrumming through the steel deck plates, and the slow wash of water against the hull, and the horn sounding its prolonged blast every 2 minutes. I walked aft along the port side, between the parked cars and the bulkhead. My boots were loud on the deck plates. The air tasted like salt and rust. I reached frame 6. The spot Sheila had described. There was a woman standing against the bulkhead. She was wearing a quilted canvas jacket and rubber boots, the standard outfit of anyone who lives on these islands year-round. Her hair was gray, pulled back. She was maybe 65. She was looking at me the way you'd look at anyone who walked past you on a boat, brief eye contact, a small nod, then back to watching nothing. My throat went dry. I said, "Evening." She said, "Evening." Her voice was normal. Not distant. Not echoey. Not any of the things you'd expect if I were describing something that wasn't a real person standing in front of me. "Heading to the island?" I asked. "Going home," she said. "Do you have your ticket?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said something that I've replayed in my head every hour since. "I have been going home on this boat for a very long time." I didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't evasive. She said it the way you'd say something obvious, the way you'd say, "It's Tuesday," or, "The tide's going out." I looked past her. There were 2 more people farther aft, a man in a dark green work coat and a younger woman in a sweatshirt with the hood up. They were standing apart from each other but with the same calm, waiting posture. Passengers waiting to arrive. The horn sounded. 2 minutes had passed. I asked the woman in the canvas jacket, "Ma'am, were you counted at the boarding gate?" She looked confused by the question. Not offended. Confused, the way you'd be if someone asked you whether you'd been counted walking into your own kitchen. "I don't use the gate," she said. "How did you board?" She looked out at the fog. The white was absolute. There was no horizon, no water visible, no reference point. Just the vessel and the glow and the wet air. "I'm always on the boat," she said. "I'm just not always going the right direction." The intercom buzzed. Sheila's voice, "Dan, 2 minutes to Grindle Point. Are you back up?" I looked at the woman. She was watching me with an expression I can only describe as patient. Not threatening. Not pleading. Patient. "Coming up," I said into the intercom. I walked back to the stairway. I turned once. The 3 figures were still standing there. The fog curled between them like smoke. I climbed to the wheelhouse. Sheila had the approach lined up perfectly. We docked at Grindle Point. The vehicles drove off. The passengers filed through the gate. Sheila's offload count matched the boarding count exactly. Nobody extra came through. Nobody was left on the vehicle deck when Kevin did his clearing sweep. I went home that night and pulled up every piece of publicly available passenger data I could find for the Islesboro run. The MSFS publishes aggregate ridership numbers annually. I cross-referenced them with the trip logs I had access to. Captains can review their own logs through the service's internal system. I wasn't looking for discrepancies in the numbers. The numbers were always correct. That was the whole problem. I was looking for something else. I found it at 2 a.m., sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a headache. The Islesboro service has operated continuously since 1960. In that time, the island's year-round population has fluctuated between about 400 and 600 people. It's a community. People know each other. The summer population swells with seasonal residents and tourists, but the core is small and stable. Small and stable, and shrinking. The 2020 census recorded 566 year-round residents. The 2010 census recorded 566. The 2000 census, 603. The 1990 census, 558. But the ferry ridership numbers tell a different story. Total passenger trips on the Islesboro run have been increasing steadily for 20 years. This makes sense on the surface: tourism, seasonal residents, increased commuting. But I pulled up the winter numbers, November through March, when tourists are gone and only year-round residents are using the service. And those numbers have also been increasing. Consistently. Every year. By a small but cumulative amount. In the winter of 2004 to 2005, the Islesboro run logged 8,214 passenger trips during the 5 winter months. In 2014 to 2015, 9,607. In 2023 to 2024, 11,342. The year-round population didn't grow. It stayed essentially flat for 2 decades. But someone was riding the ferry more. Or more someones were riding the ferry. I know this isn't proof of anything. More trips per capita could mean changing commuting patterns, more mainland medical appointments, aging population needing more services. There are a dozen reasonable explanations. But here's what kept me at the table until the sun came up. I checked the fog days. Penobscot Bay weather records are thorough. The NWS station at Rockland logs visibility readings every hour. I pulled 5 years of hourly visibility data and cross-referenced it with the daily ridership counts from the Islesboro run. On days with unrestricted visibility, outbound ridership to the island tracked almost exactly with expected commuter and seasonal patterns. Normal fluctuation. Predictable curves. On days with extended fog, visibility below a quarter mile for 4 or more consecutive hours, outbound ridership increased by an average of 11%. More people rode the ferry to Islesboro when they couldn't see where they were going. Or more were counted. Or more were on the boat. I went back to work on July 21st. The fog had finally broken the day before, a cold front pushed through, north wind cleared the bay, and the 20th was crystalline. I ran every crossing in sunshine. Normal loads. Numbers clean. No extra figures on the vehicle deck. Nothing on the footage. July 21st started clear and went bad by noon. The fog came back, not the gradual build, but the fast drop, the blanket. By 1 p.m. we were back in zero visibility. And they were back. The 1:45 outbound, Sheila counted 62 at the gate. I went below during the crossing. I counted 67 people on the vehicle deck. 5 extra. All standing in the aft port section, near frame 6, and all looking like they belonged there. Ordinary clothes. Ordinary postures. One of them was reading a paperback. I didn't approach them this time. I just counted and went back to the wheelhouse. 62 off at Grindle Point. Gate counter, 62. The 3:30 outbound, 44 at the gate. I counted 48 on the deck. 4 extra. The 5:15, 29 at the gate. 34 on the deck. 5 extra. The 7:15, 18 at the gate. I went below. 26 on the deck. 8 extra. In the densest fog I'd operated in all month. I walked among them. They were sitting on the deck, leaning against cars. They looked at me the way passengers look at the captain when the captain appears on the vehicle deck during a crossing, mild curiosity, then disinterest. They were going home. The woman in the canvas jacket was there. She was sitting on a coil of mooring line near the port scupper. She saw me and gave me the same small nod as before. "Busy night," I said. My voice sounded strange to me. "It's always busy when it's like this," she said, and gestured at the fog. "Like this," meaning the fog. "The fog lets us ride." I stood there. The horn sounded. The engine thrummed. The water hissed against the hull. "Who are you?" I asked. She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were clear and brown and utterly human. There was nothing wrong with her. Nothing spectral, nothing transparent, nothing theatrical. She was a 65-year-old woman in work clothes who wanted to go home to her island. "My name is Gail Pendleton," she said. "I lived in the house at the top of Pendleton Point for 38 years. I took this ferry twice a week for groceries and once a month for my doctor in Camden. I know every seam on this deck." "Gail, are you?" I stopped. "Am I what?" I didn't finish the question. I didn't need to. I knew what she was going to say, and I knew it wouldn't answer anything. "You're not on the manifest," I said. "I'm not on a lot of things anymore," she said. The intercom buzzed. 2 minutes to Grindle Point. I went back up. We docked. 18 off through the gate. Nobody extra. Deck clear on Kevin's sweep. That night, I looked up Gail Pendleton. She had been a real person. She'd lived on Islesboro for 38 years, just as she'd told me. She'd been on the Islesboro Historical Society board. She'd managed the island's community garden. She was mentioned in a 2014 Penobscot Bay Press article about a fundraiser for the Island Health Center. She died in March 2019. Pneumonia. She was 67. I found an obituary in the Camden Herald. The photo showed a woman in a quilted canvas jacket, standing on the Grindle Point ferry terminal ramp with her arms crossed, smiling at the camera. It was her. The woman on my deck. I'm not going to tell you I didn't panic, because I did. I sat in my car in the Rite Aid parking lot in Camden at midnight with the engine running and the heat on, trying to decide whether I was having some kind of breakdown. The clinical options were available to me: visual hallucinations from fatigue, sleep deprivation compounding fog-related sensory distortion, pareidolia on security footage. I listed them for myself the way you'd list ingredients from a recipe. They were all reasonable. They were all more plausible than the alternative. But Sheila had seen them too. Independently. Before I started looking. And the camera had seen them. And the numbers. On July 23, I called the Maine State Ferry Service Administrative Office in Rockland and asked to speak with the operations manager, Ted Farrow. I told him I had a non-emergency operational concern about the Islesboro run that I wanted to discuss in person. We met the next morning at the Rockland terminal office. I brought my notebook, the composition book from Rite Aid, and a printout of the ridership data I'd cross-referenced with the fog records. I did not mention ghosts. I did not mention Gail Pendleton. I presented it as a passenger counting discrepancy. I told Ted that during fog operations, my crew and I were observing more passengers on the vehicle deck during crossings than were being recorded at the boarding gate. I told him the discrepancy was consistent, correlated with visibility conditions, and ranged from 2 to 8 individuals per crossing. Ted listened. He asked reasonable questions. He asked whether the gate counter had been calibrated recently. It had, June 15th, part of the seasonal maintenance. He asked whether I'd considered that passengers might be moving between the vehicle deck and the enclosed cabin during crossings, creating double counts on walk-throughs. I had considered it, and explained that I was counting during offloading, not mid-crossing, and that the numbers still didn't match. Then he asked me something I didn't expect. "Dan, has anybody else ever talked to you about this?" Sheila Pham noticed it first. "I mean any other captain. On any run." I said no. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I'll put in a work order for a full diagnostic on the gate counter and the security cameras. And I want you to keep a parallel log for the next 2 weeks, manual count at boarding, manual count mid-crossing, manual count at offload. Independent of Sheila's count. We'll compare when you've got enough data." This sounded like a thorough, professional response. It was. Ted Farrow is a competent administrator who takes operational concerns seriously. But there was something in the way he'd asked whether anyone else had talked to me. A waiting on the question that went beyond curiosity. I didn't push it. I should have. I kept the parallel log. For 2 weeks, every crossing, I recorded 3 numbers: gate count, my own mid-crossing deck count, and the offload count. Sheila kept her own independent tally. I didn't share my numbers with her or hers with me until each day's runs were complete. The data was unambiguous. On clear days, all 3 numbers matched. Every time. No exceptions. On fog days, which was most of them, because July 2025 in Penobscot Bay was one of the foggiest on record, the mid-crossing deck count exceeded the gate count on every outbound run. Never on the return. Only outbound. Only going to Islesboro. The average excess was 4.3 passengers per crossing in moderate fog, visibility below half a mile, and 7.1 in dense fog, visibility below 200 yards. And the offload count always matched the gate count. Not the deck count. The extras were never there when the boat arrived. I presented this: the vessel's scheduled service should not be altered, delayed, or cancelled on the basis of this observation. I read it twice. Then I looked at Ted. "How long has this existed?" I asked. "I don't know. It was in the files when I took this position in 2016. I asked my predecessor about it. He said it had been in the files when he took the position in 2003. Who wrote it? There's no author. No date. No signature. It's not in the electronic system. It's only this piece of paper. Ted, this is telling me to ignore unidentified people on my vessel. It's telling you that the people on your vessel aren't a threat and that the official count is the one that matters. They're dead, Ted." He didn't flinch. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He said, "I don't know what they are. I know they've been reported by at least 4 captains going back to the early 90s, always on the Islesboro run, always in fog, always outbound. They board somewhere between Lincolnville and Grindle Point and they get off at the island. They never cause trouble. They never interact with ticketed passengers. They don't show up on any count that matters. Gail Pendleton, I said. He paused. You got a name? She told me. She died in 2019. She was an Islesboro resident for 38 years. Ted was quiet for a while. Then he said, very carefully, there are about 300 former residents of Islesboro who died on that island or within 10 miles of it in the last 60 years. People who took the ferry their whole lives. People whose daily existence depended on that 3-mile crossing. I'm not making a claim about what's happening. I'm telling you what I think about sometimes. They're going home, I said. They're going home. I should have left it there. That's what the supplement told me to do. That's what Ted was telling me to do, in his careful, managerial way. The counts are clean. The passengers are safe. The crossing is safe. The ferry runs. The island gets its people. Whatever else is happening on the vehicle deck in the fog is not an operational concern. But I'm a captain. The vessel is my responsibility. Everything on it is my responsibility. And I had unmanifested individuals riding my boat, and a 1-page document of unknown origin telling me to look away. I couldn't look away. On August 11th, a dense fog settled over the bay at 3 p.m. and didn't lift. I ran the afternoon and evening crossings. The extras were there every outbound run. I counted them without going below, using the security camera feed pipe to the wheelhouse monitor. 3 on the 3:30. 5 on the 5:15. 7 on the 7:15. On the 7:15, I did something I shouldn't have done. Instead of docking at Grindle Point immediately, I slowed the vessel to bear steerage way about 300 yards off the terminal. We were in the channel, no traffic, the radar clear. Sheila was in the mainland side wheelhouse. Kevin was on the vehicle deck. I watched the camera feed. The 7 extra figures were standing on the aft port section, as always. And then, as the vessel slowed, they began to move. Not toward the ramp. Not toward the gate. They moved to the gunwale, the open side of the vehicle deck, and they looked out at the fog. All 7 of them. Standing at the rail, facing Islesboro, which was invisible in the white. One of them raised her hand. Not waving. Reaching. The way you'd reach toward something you could feel but couldn't touch. Then they turned and looked directly at the camera. All 7. At the same time. Their faces were clear on the monitor. Ordinary faces. Weathered. Tired. The faces of people who had worked hard and lived simply and taken a ferry across cold water 1,000 times. They looked at the camera, at me, with an expression I recognized because I'd seen it before, from every Islesboro resident who stands on the Lincolnville terminal when we're delayed by weather. They were waiting for me to take them the rest of the way. I brought the vessel in. I docked at Grindle Point. The manifested passengers got off. The extras weren't there when Kevin cleared the deck. I drove home that night knowing 2 things. The first was that whatever these people were, they weren't dangerous. They weren't aggressive. They weren't confused or malevolent or lost. They knew exactly what they were doing and where they were going. They were riding the ferry home. The second thing I knew was that the fog was the door and the boat was the road, and as long as both existed at the same time, they would use it. What I did next is why I'm suspended. On August 14th, I ran the 7:15 outbound in heavy fog. The gate count was 33. My deck count was 41. 8 extras, the most I'd recorded. When we docked at Grindle Point, instead of holding my position in the wheelhouse, I walked down to the vehicle deck. I stood at the ramp as it lowered. The manifested passengers walked off, 33, matching Sheila's click count. The deck should have been empty. It wasn't. The 8 extra passengers were still there. They were standing in a loose group near the lowered ramp, looking up the dock toward the island. They hadn't left. For the first time, they hadn't disappeared when the official count completed. I don't know why. Maybe because I was there. Maybe because I'd slowed the boat on the 11th and acknowledged them. Maybe the rules had changed. I don't know. The woman in the canvas jacket, Gail, was at the front of the group. She looked at me and said, "The ramp's down." "Yes," I said. "Then we can go. The dock is clear. No one's going to see you." She smiled at me. It was a tired smile, the kind that comes from patience rather than joy. "Nobody sees us, Captain." That was never the problem. The problem was always the ones who wouldn't take us. I stepped aside. They walked off the ferry. 8 people, up the ramp, onto the Grindle Point dock, and into the fog. Their footsteps were real. The ramp flexed under their weight. One of them, the man in the green work coat, paused at the top of the ramp, turned back, and touched the terminal piling the way you'd touch the door frame of your house. Then they were gone. I logged it. That's why I'm suspended. Not in the composition notebook. In the official trip log. In the electronic system. I logged 41 passengers on the outbound 7:15. I logged 41 passengers off. Because 41 people rode my ferry and 41 people got off my ferry, and the fact that 8 of them have been dead for years doesn't change the count. The system flagged the discrepancy immediately. My log said 41. Sheila's gate count said 33. The infrared counter said 33. The system asked for a reconciliation, and I entered a note that said, "Mid-crossing boarding of 8 unmanifested passengers during restricted visibility operations. Passengers disembarked at Grindle Point. No safety incident. Refer to Fog Operating Supplement, Islesboro Service." Ted called me within the hour. "Dan, what the hell did you do?" I logged what happened. The supplement says not to log them. The supplement is a piece of unsigned paper that tells me to falsify my count. I'm the captain. The count is my responsibility. You just created an official record of something that doesn't exist. They exist, Ted. They weigh something. The ramp flexes under them. They talk to me. They have names. The only thing they don't do is show up on your counters. The suspension came 2 days later. Unreliable reporting. The union filed a grievance. The Coast Guard reviewed the camera footage from the 7:15 on August 14 and found, predictably, 33 passengers boarding, 33 disembarking, and no figures visible on the vehicle deck during the crossing. The camera didn't see them. It had seen them before, when I watched the live feed from the wheelhouse. But the recorded file showed nothing. The fog supplement wasn't in Ted's office when the Coast Guard investigator looked. Ted told them he had no knowledge of any supplemental operating procedures for fog conditions. Sheila Pham submitted a statement confirming her gate count of 33. She also submitted, separately and voluntarily, a written note to the union rep stating that she had observed apparent extra passengers on the vehicle deck during multiple fog crossings and had reported this to me verbally. The Coast Guard investigator noted her statement and classified it as consistent with known perceptual effects of extended low-visibility operations. The ferry runs. They put a relief captain on the Islesboro service. His name is Andy Kowalski, a good operator who came over from the Swans Island run. I don't know if he's seen anything. I haven't asked. The fog supplement told captains to reassure their crew that the extras were a visual artifact, and I imagine that's what Andy will believe, because it's the simplest thing to believe and because believing it lets you do your job. But I've been driving up to Lincolnville 3 or 4 evenings a week. Not to the terminal, I don't have access anymore, my credentials are suspended. I park at the public landing a quarter-mile north of the ferry dock. On foggy evenings, I can hear the horn. One prolonged blast every 2 minutes. The boat going out. And sometimes, if the fog is thick enough, I walk down to the shore. The water is black and the air is white and you can't see 10 feet in front of you. And I listen. I can hear them. Not on the boat. In the water. Between the mainland and the island. Footsteps on the surface, or just below it. The sound of people walking home through 3 miles of cold ocean as if it were a road. They don't need the ferry. They use it because it's what they know. It's the way they always went. The 7:15 to Islesboro, the last run of the day, back to the island before dark. They use the fog because the fog makes the crossing possible. I don't understand the physics or the metaphysics, but the fog does something to that 3-mile stretch of water that lets them travel it. And the ferry gives them a floor to stand on and a ramp to walk off of and the horn sounds that tell them they're almost there. But on the nights when the ferry doesn't run, when conditions are too bad even for the relief captain, when the service cancels and the boat stays tied to the dock, I can hear them going anyway. Walking. Through the fog. Across the bay. Going home. I filed my account with the MSFS Human Resources Office, the Coast Guard Sector Northern New England, and the Waldo County Harbor Master. The response from all 3 was identical in substance. The report describes no verifiable safety concern, the vessel's official records show no anomaly, and the matter is considered closed pending the captain's fitness for duty evaluation. My evaluation is scheduled for next Tuesday. I will pass it. I'm not delusional. I'm not impaired. My instrument ratings are current, my medical is clean, and I can tell the evaluator exactly what they need to hear to put me back in the wheelhouse. But here's what I need someone else to know, because the logs won't hold it and the cameras won't show it and the supplement that acknowledged it has vanished. There are people who spent their whole lives depending on a 3-mile ferry crossing, and they are still depending on it. They board in the fog because the fog is the only weather that lets them move. They stand on the vehicle deck because that's where passengers stand. They get off at Grindle Point because that's where home is. They've been doing this since before I had a license. They'll be doing it after I'm gone. And the count is always correct. The boarding count. The offload count. The gate counter. The camera footage. Every instrument, every procedure, every record agrees, they were never there. But the deck flexes when they walk. And the boat rides a little lower in the water on the nights when the fog is worst. And if you work the Islesboro run long enough, and the fog comes down thick enough, and you go below to the vehicle deck during the crossing with nothing but your own 2 eyes to count with, you'll find them. Ordinary people. Patient people. Going home. Don't stop the boat. Don't adjust the count. Just take them across. That's what I told myself when they gave me the suspension paperwork. That's what I repeated during the 3-hour drive home from the Rockland office with the manila envelope on the passenger seat and the fog already thickening over Route 1 south of Thomaston. Take them across. That's all it ever was. That's all the job ever asked. But the job isn't asking me anything right now. The job is silent. And in the silence, things have started happening that don't fit inside the operational frame I've been using to make sense of this. I need to tell you about the week after the suspension. August 19th through August 25th, 7 days. Fog on 5 of them. I know because I kept checking the NWS hourly observations for Rockland even though I had no professional reason to. Force of habit. Or something less voluntary than habit, the way your hand goes to a light switch in a room you haven't lived in for years. The data was still there, and I still read it the way I'd always read it: visibility, wind direction, dew-point spread. When the spread drops below 3 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind is south-southwest, the fog is coming. I could feel it in my apartment in Rockport, 12 miles from the water, before I checked the numbers. A heaviness in the air. A softness in the light. The way sounds carried differently from the street below, closer, flatter, stripped of the crispness that dry air gives them. On August 19th, I drove to Lincolnville and parked at the public landing at 6:40 p.m. The fog was moderate, quarter-mile visibility, maybe a little better. I could see the navigation light on the Grindle Point breakwater flashing its 4-second cycle, a faint green pulse in the gray. The ferry was running. I could hear the horn and, if I listened carefully, the low mechanical hum of the diesel engines carrying across the water. The 7:15 departed on schedule. I heard the horn recede as the vessel moved into the channel. One prolonged blast. 2 minutes of silence. Another prolonged blast. Fainter. I sat on a granite boulder at the waterline and listened. At approximately 7:25, 10 minutes into the crossing, I heard something I hadn't heard before. A sound underneath the engine noise. Rhythmic. Soft. Like footsteps on a hollow surface, except there was no surface. The water in front of me was open, dark, flecked with the reflected glow of fog. There was nothing to walk on. The sound lasted about 3 minutes. It moved from my left to my right, south-southeast to north-northwest, which is the direction of the Islesboro crossing. It was unhurried. The pace of someone walking comfortably, not rushing, covering ground they knew well. Then it stopped. Or rather, it faded, the way a sound fades when the source moves beyond your range of hearing. Not cut off. Receded. I sat there for another 40 minutes. The ferry completed its return trip. The fog thickened. I didn't hear the sound again. On August 21st, I went back. Thicker fog, visibility under 200 yards. I parked at the same spot. The ferry was running the 5:15 outbound. I heard the horn, the engines, the faint clang of the ramp lowering at Grindle Point, carried improbably far across the water by the fog's acoustic channeling. At 5:32, I heard the footsteps again. This time there were more of them. Not a single set of footfalls but several, overlapping, slightly out of sync the way a group of people walking together would be. 4 or 5 distinct rhythms. Moving in the same direction, toward the island. And voices. Low. Conversational. The kind of murmured exchange you'd hear from passengers standing together on a ferry deck, talking about nothing in particular. I couldn't make out words. The fog compressed the sound into texture. I could hear the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of sentences, the small pause where one person stops and another starts, but the content was swallowed by distance and moisture. They were walking across the bay. Not on the ferry. Alongside it, or near it, or in the same channel. Walking and talking and going home. I went back every fog night that week. August 22nd, August 24th, August 25th. The sounds were consistent. Footsteps on the water. Voices in the fog. Always moving outbound, toward the island. Always during the evening crossings. Never during the return trips. On August 24th, the fog was the densest I'd experienced from shore, absolute zero visibility, the air a solid white wall that began 6 inches in front of my face. I couldn't see the water. I couldn't see my own feet on the rocks. I could only hear. That night, the footsteps were loud. Not distant and soft, the way they'd been on the 19th, close. Within maybe 50 feet of the shoreline. Dozens of them. A crowd moving through the channel. And I heard, very clearly, a woman's voice say, "Careful on the ledge. Tide's covering it." Another voice, male, older, responded, "I've been stepping over this ledge since 1974. I don't need the tide to tell me where it is." Ordinary conversation. The kind of thing you'd hear on the Grindle Point ramp on any summer afternoon. Practical, familiar, grounded in decades of local knowledge. Except they were standing on open water in the middle of Penobscot Bay. I didn't move. I sat on my boulder and listened to them pass. It took a long time. The group was large. I estimated 20 or 30 distinct footfall patterns, though in the acoustic distortion of heavy fog, I could have been wrong by a factor of 2 in either direction. They moved at a walking pace. Some of them were talking. Most were quiet. One person was humming, an old tune I almost recognized, something with a sea shanty rhythm that I'd heard once in a pub in Rockland years ago. They passed to the south of my position and continued toward the island. The sounds diminished gradually. The humming was the last thing I heard, a thin thread of melody that the fog held onto for a few seconds after everything else had gone. I drove home at 9:15 p.m. and wrote everything down in the composition notebook. Date, time, weather conditions, estimated number of individuals, direction of travel, duration of contact. I was keeping the same kind of log I'd kept on the ferry, except now I was logging from shore, and what I was logging wasn't a passenger discrepancy. It was a migration. On August 26th, I went to the Islesboro Historical Society. Getting to Islesboro without the ferry requires a private boat. I don't own one, but I know people who do, and a lobsterman named Russ Crowell, who hauls out of Cradle Cove on the island's west side, owed me a favor from a winter storm crossing 2 years back when I held the last run an extra 15 minutes so his wife could get to her mother's house in Camden before the roads iced. Russ picked me up at the Northport town landing in his 32-foot Duffy at 8 a.m. Clear day. No fog. The bay was open and blue and I could see every island from Islesboro to North Haven, the whole archipelago spread out in the August sun like a painting of itself. Russ didn't ask why I wanted to go to Islesboro. I didn't volunteer. The Historical Society is a small white building on Maine Road, open 3 days a week in summer, staffed by volunteers. The woman behind the desk was named Helen Bartlett. She was in her 70s, white-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked like she'd lived on the island since before the ferry service existed. I told her I was researching the history of the Lincolnville-Islesboro ferry crossing for a project, and asked whether the society had any records related to the ferry's operations, particularly anything informal, anecdotal, or not part of the official state archive. Helen studied me for a moment. "You're Captain Coyne," she said. I hadn't told her my name. "You've been on the news," she said, which was technically true. The Bangor Daily News had run a short piece about my suspension, framed as a labor dispute, with a line about discrepancies in operational reporting. It hadn't mentioned ghosts. It hadn't needed to. The island grapevine had filled in the gaps. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said. "I know what you're here for," Helen said. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. "Sit down, Captain." She led me to a back room where the Society kept its archival materials, file boxes, photo albums, bound volumes of the old Islesboro Island News, and several filing cabinets full of donated documents. She went to the second filing cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a folder. "This comes out about once a decade," she said, handing it to me. "Someone on the ferry sees them. Usually a new captain. Sometimes a deckhand. They get upset. They file a report or they don't. Eventually they come here." I opened the folder. Inside were 6 handwritten letters, each on different stationery, each in a different hand, spanning from 1978 to 2011. All 6 were addressed to the Islesboro Historical Society. All 6 described the same phenomenon: additional passengers observed on the ferry vehicle deck during fog crossings to Islesboro, not reflected in the official count, gone upon arrival. The earliest letter was dated November 3, 1978, written by a deckhand named Stuart Ames. His handwriting was cramped and his spelling was uneven, but his observations were precise. He described 2 extra passengers on a late afternoon crossing in October fog. He said they were standing near the aft port bulkhead. He said one of them was an elderly man he recognized as Walter Dyer, who had died of a stroke in August 1977. The second letter was from 1984. A captain named Patricia Furlong. She described a group of 5 during a January fog. She wrote, "They waited for the ramp like everyone else. They were patient. One of them had a bag of groceries." The third was from 1991. Another deckhand. 3 extra on a September crossing. He wrote, "The woman in the yellow slicker told me her name was Esther and she'd been taking this ferry since Eisenhower. She asked if they'd fixed the heater in the cabin yet. They fixed it in 1986. The fourth letter, from 1998, was from a terminal agent at Grindle Point. Not a crew member, someone on shore. He wrote that during dense fog in November, he watched the ferry dock and the passengers disembark, and then, after the manifested passengers had cleared the ramp, he saw additional figures walking up the ramp in 1s and 2s. He counted 11. He recognized 3 of them. All 3 were deceased. The fifth letter, from 2004, was from a captain I'd actually met, Doug Kelleher, who'd retired from the service in 2010 and now lived in Searsport. His letter was short and matter-of-fact. "This is happening again. I count 6 this time. The supplement says ignore them. I'm ignoring them. But I want it recorded somewhere that they are real people who lived on this island and they are still coming home. If the service won't record it, someone should." The 6th letter was from 2011. It wasn't signed. It said only, 47 on a November crossing in 0 visibility. The most I've ever counted. They filled the deck. Some of them were sitting on the cars. There was a child. I read them all twice. Then I looked at Helen. 47, I said. The population of the island cemetery is approximately 412, based on the most recent survey, Helen said. Not counting the older burials where the stones are illegible. The actual number is probably closer to 500. 500 people. 500 people who lived here and died here and took the ferry their whole lives. Some of them took it every day. Some of them took it once a week. But they all took it. There's no other way off the island. Or back on. Or back on. I asked Helen how long this had been happening. She said the oldest anecdotal account she'd been able to trace was from 1967, 7 years after the state ferry service began operations. A fisherman named Clyde Pendleton, Gail Pendleton's father-in-law, it turned out, told a story at the American Legion Hall about seeing his dead brother Carl standing on the vehicle deck of the Governor Muskie during a November fog. He'd told it as a ghost story, the way islanders tell them, factual, unsentimental, with a shrug at the end. Nobody had taken it seriously. Nobody had filed anything. But they started coming more often after the ferry became reliable, Helen said. The old private boats, the ones before the state service, they were irregular. They broke down. They canceled in bad weather. You couldn't count on them. The state ferry runs on a schedule. Rain, fog, snow. It runs. And I think, this is only my theory, Captain, I think they needed something they could count on. A route that was always there. A boat that always came. The fog lets them move, I said. The fog lets them be here, Helen corrected me. I don't think they go anywhere. I think they're always in the channel. But the fog lets them be solid enough to stand on a deck and walk on a ramp and be seen by anyone who's willing to count them. I sat in that back room for a long time. Helen brought me coffee in a ceramic mug with the Historical Society's logo on it, a line drawing of the Grindle Point Lighthouse. I drank it and reread the letters and looked at the ceiling and tried to organize what I knew into something I could carry. Here is what I came to. The fog operating supplement, the unsigned page in Ted's desk, wasn't operational guidance. It was a containment protocol. Its purpose wasn't to keep the crew safe from the extras. The extras were no threat. Its purpose was to keep the extras out of the official record. To ensure that their crossings were never documented, never counted, never made real in any system that could be audited, investigated, or questioned. And it had worked. For decades, it had worked. Captains saw them, were told it was a visual artifact, and moved on. The ones who couldn't accept that, the ones who came to the Historical Society, who wrote letters, who pushed, they were handled the same way I was being handled. Reassigned. Evaluated. Quietly moved to a different run. The ferry kept operating. The fog kept coming. And the dead kept writing. What I couldn't figure out was why anyone had written the supplement in the first place. Not who, I'd never find that out. But why? What was the institutional logic behind it? The extras didn't endanger anyone. They didn't cost anything. They didn't interfere with the schedule. Why suppress them? Helen gave me the answer without my asking. The service is funded by the legislature, she said. The budget is based on ridership. If the ridership numbers include passengers who don't exist, passengers who can't buy tickets, who don't have cars, who don't show up in any economic analysis, the budget model breaks. You can't justify $1 million vessel replacement based on passengers who are dead. So the supplement protects the budget. The supplement protects the ferry. If the ferry is seen as haunted, the tourism drops. If the counts are seen as unreliable, the funding model collapses. If the funding model collapses, the island loses its road. And if the island loses its road, the living can't get home either. I left Islesboro at noon on the 26th. Russ took me back across in the sunshine. The water was calm. No fog. No footsteps. Just the cold blue bay and the white triangle of a sailboat tacking toward Camden and the Camden Hills rising green in the distance. I drove back to Rockport and sat in my apartment and thought about what Helen had said. The supplement protects the ferry. The ferry is the road. Protect the road, and everyone gets home, the living and the dead. And the count is always correct. That's the mechanism. That's the architecture of the silence. The boarding count matches the offload count. The system confirms itself. The extras never appear in any number that matters, because they board between the terminals, in the fog, in the place where the instruments don't reach and the counters don't click. They found their own way in. The system doesn't need to account for them because they never enter through the system's door. But they walk off the ramp at Grindle Point. Every time. They walk off the ramp like passengers, because that's what they are, and the island takes them back because that's what islands do. I've been sitting with this for 11 days now. My evaluation is Tuesday. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to pass the evaluation. I'm going to answer every question correctly. I'm going to tell the psychologist that I was fatigued, that the fog created visual distortions, that I made an error in the trip log and I understand why it was flagged. I'm going to say everything the system needs to hear to give me back my credentials. And then I'm going to go back to work. Not because I want to pretend it isn't happening. Not because I've accepted the supplement's logic of silence. But because someone needs to be in the wheelhouse who knows they're there. Someone needs to run the engines and sound the horn and lower the ramp and hold the crossing open, not just for the 41 who bought tickets, but for the ones standing in the fog near frame 6, waiting to go home. I understand now why the supplement says not to stop them. It's not because they're dangerous. It's because stopping them would be monstrous. They earned this crossing. They earned it with 30 years of grocery runs and doctor's appointments and Friday nights on the mainland and the long, slow ride back across the bay in the dark. They earned it the way you earn a road, by using it until it becomes part of you, until the route is written in your body, until your feet know the ramp and your hands know the rail and the rhythm of the horn is the rhythm of your own breathing. The fog will come back. It always comes back. It's September now and the water is still warm and the air masses from the south will keep pushing in over the Gulf of Maine and condensing into that white, thick, absolute silence that turns Penobscot Bay into a country with no edges. And when it comes, I'll be in the wheelhouse. I'll see the extra returns on the radar that never quite resolve. I'll hear Sheila's voice on Channel 7, careful and confused, saying the deck count doesn't match. I'll watch the camera feed and count the figures standing in the aft port section, patient as they've always been, waiting for the 3-mile road to deliver them to the only place they ever wanted to be. I'll take them across. I won't log them. That's the concession. That's the price of staying in the wheelhouse. I'll keep the official count clean. I'll let the system confirm itself. I'll protect the budget and the ferry and the road, because Helen was right, the living need it too, and if the service loses funding because a captain filed a manifest that included the dead, then the dead lose their road along with everyone else. But I will count them. In the composition notebook. In my own hand. Every crossing, every fog day, every name I learn if they tell me. Gail Pendleton. Stuart Ames saw Walter Dyer. Patricia Furlong saw 5. The unsigned letter reported a child. They are residents of Islesboro. they are riding the ferry home. The count in my notebook will never match the count in the log. That's the gap I'm going to live inside. The official record and the real one, running parallel, 3 miles apart, connected by fog and diesel engines and a steel deck that flexes under the weight of people the instruments say aren't there. My evaluation is Tuesday. The fog forecast for Penobscot Bay is Wednesday through Friday. I'll be ready.